I'm just turned on the tape recorder. I just attended a really lovely Pride open mic organized by my friends, my new friends, Chelsea and Zara, and a bunch of other folks. And I met someone named Sam, and Sam and I had a lot in common, and it sounds like I'm a lot like Sam's husband, which is fun. And what I did was I told a story, and I let the audience decide which one. And the one that I fell upon was the story of how I was named in a defamation lawsuit in the Ontario Superior Court. And like, the details of that were settled confidentially, but like the fact that I was named in a suit, I can say that. But as I was listening to the performances and thinking about what stories I might otherwise tell, because like I wanted to give people the choice, so I had to be ready for whichever one they would pick. There was one other one I would have liked to have told, and I think what I'm going to do now in the roughly 30 minutes I have before I turn up in Moncton is I'm going to tell one of them. Maybe I'll tell two. So, 10 years ago, I spent 2 months in Berlin around this time of the year. Would have been around now, 10 years ago in 2014 that I came home. And one of the funny things I saw when I was out there, we're going to call it Moby Dick, because if I tell you what it is, it spoils the fun. So this is the time that I spotted what I'm going to say is like, I guess for a Canadian, something that might resemble a mythological creature. But it wasn't a creature, it was something else. So, to give you an idea of the environment that I found myself in at the time, I was renting a room while I was in Berlin from someone who lived in the suburbs towards the west. So I would come eastbound on the subway line, which would get me into downtown Berlin, and then I'd get out of the train station, and I had about 2 blocks to walk to school. And my school was organized by the DAAD, which is an organization that more or less pays for people to learn German, because after the 1980s, Germany had some work to do on its, international reputation, as you might imagine. So when I'm walking those 2 blocks from the subway station to the school, I am walking perpendicular to one of the most important streets in Berlin, and it's called Friedrichstraße. And think of Friedrichstraße as like a Frederick Street, which is funny because one of my childhood homes was on a street called Frederick, but I haven't lived there going on more than 15 years. So in Friedrichstraße, this is a street that is named Friedrich because 2 of the more famous kings of what used to be called Prussia, which Berlin was a part of, one of the many city-states or nation-states that became the modern Germany. Friedrichstraße was literally like the King's Street, and you could get from one of his castles in Berlin, or one of his residences, and you could take it all the way to Portbou, where another one of his residences was located. And I'm thinking specifically of Frederick II, like Frederick the Great, who's not the centerpiece of this story, but the street is. So Friedrichstraße eventually, if I remember correctly, meets Brandenburger Tor, which is the big gate. So when the German national football team won the World Cup in 2014 while I was there, so the celebrations took place at the gate, at Brandenburger Tor. Tor is gate. Brandenburger is the name. So you go eastbound on Friedrichstrasse, and Friedrichstrasse in this section of the city, because it's a fairly long road, is twinned. So you have 2 lanes going in one direction, you have a concrete divider in between them, and you have 2 lanes going in the other direction. And in Berlin, every meaningful street has separate, isolated bike lanes that go in both directions. And typically the bike lanes will be on one of the streets, like either on the left side of the street or on the right side of the street, and they will have a going lane and an oncoming lane that is divided by a yellow line. You don't passing on bikes, like there's a whole etiquette to that, because in most of Berlin you can bike everywhere that you're going. A lot of mail is delivered by bicycle rather than by vehicle. And instead of complaining about pedestrians, people in Berlin complain about the cyclists. So you have to remember that Friedrichstrasse has pedestrian traffic on both sides, has bike traffic going in opposite directions on at least one side of the street. I forget if it's on both, but I think it's just on one side. And then you have car traffic going through, and it's like the car traffic is moving, but it's not moving particularly fast. And so I became accustomed to having a commute whereby I would leave my guest house and find my way downtown, which happened pretty quickly. Nice, efficient run, quick walk to the subway station, subway ride to downtown, get off at downtown, walk 2 blocks south, where at the first block you run into Friedrichstrasse, and then on to the school. And I would tuck into a little alleyway a block after Friedrichstrasse heading south, and I would pop into my little academy. And often when class was out, which typically they let us out in the early afternoon, because all of the 20-somethings would get together and often plan something for that evening, because we were both like studying, but we were also just being tourists and enjoying, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And there were people from all over the world, specifically, especially Europe, but like we had folks from all over the place. But often, some nights when we didn't have any plans or our plans were only later, I would walk home. I would sometimes stop at a couple of bookstores that were right off, my route. Sometimes I just went home. And on one of these days, I remember that I had maybe made a few purchases, and I was carrying them and readjusting them, and I have a kind of a habit of walking around with more bags and backpacks than any reasonable person needs. I tend to encumber myself with things. But I'm just kind of readjusting things, and I'm catching up with my fiance back home, and we're trying to make the time difference work, and so it means that I need to talk to her at certain times of the day, but not others. And I remember that I was talking to Chantal, probably just like exchanging messages, and all of a sudden I stop and I see Moby Dick, and Moby Dick just trundles along by on Friedrichstrasse, and I'm so absorbed by the sighting that I kind of just fall to my knees and start laughing hysterically. Like I must have seemed insane, and it's possible that I then I may have called Chantal in some configuration and just left her a message describing the thing. And this is what Moby Dick looked like. So, in Germany, and again, my experience of Germany was just Berlin and a quick stop in the neighboring city of Dresden. So I didn't take in that much of Germany. There's a lot of regional differences, like you would expect in any nation with a rich history of different portions of it, and the way that those communities form around each other, around Bavaria, around Munich, Leipzig, other cities. And I could have gone to one of those cities, but I ultimately decided to go to the capital. So in Germany, you can quite easily purchase a beer from a corner store, open carry it, and drink it. And you can take that to your bar if you're going out, and you can buy a drink at one bar and finish it there, or take it with you to the next one. Bar hopping is really fun in Berlin because you can just go anywhere you want, and like patios are simple, and there's just kind of no nonsense with respect to like how you just enjoy your free time. And people are like, sure, there would be like a moral panic in Canada if we changed the laws to be that way, but like the reality is, like, Berliners are really civilized. Like, I'm sure there are lots of situations that I did not personally experience where like people go overboard with the drinking, but like I was around Berlin at times when like crazy things were going on, and like the kind of violence that you would expect in a North American city in that kind of environment is not something I ever experienced when I was in Berlin. And I feel like my experience was representative of the differences between our nation and that nation at that time. Obviously 10 years have passed. But you can drink in public. And so because of that, there's a thing that you can do when you're in Berlin, which is riding the whale. And the whale, not called the whale. Again, I was using Moby Dick as a metonymy for something else, as a substitution. The whale was basically, you know a tandem bike where you have two or more people sharing the same bicycle, but they're all pedaling, and maybe you've bolted your kid onto that and the kid is pretending to pedal, but like they don't need to. So what you have is a large vehicle that is on wheels. I believe it's on 3 wheels, right? 1 wheel at the front, 2 at the rear, like a 3-wheeled motorbike. But it's not a motorbike, it's a boat. And this boat has a capacity for what we'll say is like, I think it ended up being about a dozen people. And you have 6 per side, and they're not lined up like passengers in a normal vehicle or like on a bus. They're actually all facing one another, and there is one operator at the front who is actually driving the vehicle. And you have a row of 6 people facing another row of 6 people, and they are on the sides of the vehicle facing one another, whereas the driver is facing dead ahead and is partitioned like a bus driver from the passengers. And the people seated across from one another are all on stools, and they're pedaling, because part of how this vehicle is getting itself around is, and I don't know the interior mechanics of this, I just saw it with my 2 eyeballs, and I didn't like enroll to do this. They're all pedaling. So you have 2 rows of people at a table pedaling, and what they're doing while they're pedaling is they're drinking beer. So put yourself on the sidewalk, on a street, in a foreign land, as a foreigner, a Canadian, and you're looking out into the street, and headed from west to east, you have this boat-sized vehicle that has a roof on the top but is otherwise completely open with no real windows, and everyone is at a bar pedaling, and they each have a tap supplying them with beer, which they are drinking. And if I recall correctly, there's an entire process by which they keep everybody hydrated and they keep everybody moving, which is why they're pedaling the bike, but they're not actually driving it. Someone who is not inebriated is driving it. And these people are just knocking back beer while driving, but they're not driving, they're being driven. And the cultural absurdity of like the impossibility of doing something like this in Canada without going through like a whole rigmarole to try to figure it out how you would pass this through the bylaws or something. Germany, this is just a tourist attraction where you get to ride this thing, this monstrosity, and I'm sure like you can look it up later, and it was truly one of the great moments of my time in Berlin, and a realization of just how like a small change like open carry laws, which we don't have here but that Germany has and other European nations have, how much that changes the calculus of what you are able to do if you can be licensed for it. And of course, Amsterdam has those very famous pot bars and pot cafes, and cat cafes are an increasing occurrence in some larger cities. And I don't know, it's just like a whaleboat for drinking. It's just, man, it was a heck of a time. I took about, let's see, we're at 17 minutes. I have enough time to tell this other one. This one's shorter. So you might recall a moment ago I said that all the 20-somethings hung out together. So when I went to school, I was enrolled in a high intermediate level German course. I had taken some German at university. I had continued to not so much read difficult texts in German because I studied literature, I studied philosophy. Obviously, this is not trying to read a children's book in German. I'm trying to find a way to engage very complex cultural products produced by German writers that are as difficult to read as Balzac is to read in French or William Blake is to read in English. And so I'm there to study the language and to try to somehow engage with the literature. And I bought a bunch of German books and just shipped them home. I still can't read basically any of them. But it made sense since I was in my mid-20s to hang out with the other 20-somethings. A lot of them either had obtained a master's degree somewhere or were in the process of doing a master's degree. I was in the middle of a doctorate. So some of us, almost all of us, had university degrees. And we became kind of a group as a class. Some of our classmates were teenagers. They kept to themselves. Like, why would we hang out with teenagers? They had their own friends. They stayed in their own networks. At the guest house where I was at, there was actually a couple of Italians who had come up from the Vienna area. Basically, if I recall, I can't remember where the border is. That they came from basically where one of the places where Germany and Italy meet, and they were like 17. So like I didn't hang out, like I talked to them all the time, but like I hung out with people my own age or older. So there was a group of us, and as you know, in social dynamics, sometimes a group becomes a subgroup. So more often than not, when I wanted to hang out with somebody, I hung out with two women. I hung out with Sonia and Bruna. And Bruna has no bummer stories, but Sonia has several. So thankfully, this is not one of the bummer stories. But this one's pretty funny. So, you're in a foreign country, you're meeting up with friends, you're in a country, some of us were coming from countries where open carry laws were not a thing. So obviously we took advantage, and we would meet up, we would have dinner together, and sometimes that was it. Sometimes we went out and we partied, or we went to bars, or sometimes there were events or raves or dance parties, and we hung out. So, and sometimes, again, like, we would have class the next day, we toned it down, but sometimes we just let ourselves cut loose. This was one of the times where a bunch of us went out to a bar and we started getting really drunk, and then Bruna, Sonia, and I split off and kept drinking, and we went until the bars closed, and I think we all got home very early in the morning the next day. In the middle of all that, we had decided to leave our bar. We were about done drinking, and we got the munchies. So, you know, if I was in Moncton, where I live, and I had gone out drinking and I was feeling the munchies, I'm almost certainly going to get some pizza. And turns out that's what everyone does in other parts of the world sometimes. So this is where who Bruna and Sonia are becomes important. Bruna is an Italian woman who had spent a ton of time in France and in Spain. Bruna had French, Spanish, and Italian as languages. French and Italian, and was picking up German and maybe had some Spanish. I don't think her Spanish was that strong. Whereas Sonia was very actively developing her English even more than it already was, but is from Russia, knew Russian, picking up German. Sonia had some ambitions to maybe emigrate to Germany one day. And Sonia grew up in Moscow, Russia, and actually emigrated with her mother to Haifa, Israel, where her mother, I believe, remarried a Jewish man. So that was our group. And we, you know, obviously the bummer stories have all to do with the Israel stuff. Thankfully, this story does not involve any of that. We were just drinking. We were all drinking buddies. Often it was the three of us that would be the last ones. Like, we would split off. Other people would go wherever they wanted to. We would go where we wanted to. We had the munchies and we were drunk. So we went to get pizza, and we just kind of like saw a place that was like kind of ground level basement with like a big wheel of large sliced pizza. And it's like, oh, that looks like something. We've all experienced that in different ways in the countries where we're from, you know, and we just went to the default, let's go get some pizza. And we go in and we order this pizza and pay for it. We go outside, and I think one of us got another beer, and a couple of us just like had like a couple of pops or whatever. We start eating this pizza, and almost immediately we sober up, because we all look at one another and go, this pizza is absolute dog shit. This is the worst pizza that any three of us have had. And like, you have to think about it in this term, right? We've all had pizza from like the United States, Canada, Russia, Israel, Italy, like Neapolitan pizza from frickin' Italy, Spain, France, like we've had, like, between the three of us, we've had pizza across multiple continents. And one of us is an Italian person. And we're eating this pizza, and I swear to God, it looks like a New York slice. It's pretty thin. It's very foldable. It's absolutely an imitation of New York slice pizza. But the crust is like cardboard, and the toppings are sparse. The tomato sauce is cooked and yet still tastes raw, and everything about it is awful. And we're just eating this pizza and we're just going, why is this so bad? And it's like we were eating all kinds of different food when we were out in Germany. Like, there was a moment when we went to Dresden and there was a restaurant called Ontario. and it's like, hey, isn't Ontario a province in your country? And I was like, what are they selling at this restaurant? That's a story for another time. But it's like what is Canadian food, right? But we know, broadly speaking, that like pizza has some of its most important origins in Italy, and it's been transformed everywhere that pizza has ended up. And Germany does all sorts of food really well. They have like the fast food stuff. They have like different cuisines from different nations. There's a lot of Turkish folks that have immigrated to Germany over the years, and a bunch of them have ended up in Berlin. There is amazing shawarma everywhere in Berlin. Currywurst is a street food that you can encounter in Berlin, and it's amazing, right? This is not a place that is bad with food. But for whatever reason, this specific pizza, which people were eating like this was normal fucking food, was the worst that any of us had ever had. And Sonia and I were a little tighter than Sonia, Bruna and I. Bruna sometimes just wanted to be on her own. Sonia and I were so appalled by this experience that the very next day after class, no, we didn't go to class the next day. The very next day, we were going to a museum. We gave ourselves some extra time because we both expected to be hungover, and we largely were. We had pizza again. And this time we went to like a different part of Berlin just to kind of validate like was this pizza going to be at least like edible? And we were sober this time, and we ate the pizza, and it's like it was just as bad. And it was like a completely different neighborhood in Berlin. And I think we had pizza one more time, and it was when we were in Dresden. Instead of eating at Ontario, where the steaks were like 30 euros a pop, Dresden is an absolute tourist trap. We went to a tourist trap pizza place, and that was like maybe a few weeks after this story, and that pizza was just as bad. And I can't tell you why that was. I do not know the specifics of how pizza was imported into German culture. But what I do know is the pizza I did end up having was real bad.